Okay, hello. I had to create a video on this because it's a surprisingly complex thing inside Codesandbox, and that is models. So models in itself isn't very complex because they only need like a state for it being open or not. We want to open the model and want to close the model. And when we close the model, we want to give that function a payload so that the result of opening it is that payload. Now, the tricky thing with Codesandbox is that it will be very difficult to isolate everything inside components. And the reason is that we have different things that wants to manage these models. For example, VS Code, which is a side effect, needs to open a model and know about the result of it. Like in live mode, we have, it's very likely that we want the host of a classroom session to open a model, and that should be reflected on the clients, for example. It's also very likely that one component is responsible for opening a model and a completely different component is responsible for closing it. So we want to avoid all these props passing shitty stuff that often happens in React. So that's kind of like the state of it. And I created this proof of concept that I'm going to go through now. And basically, the way this works is that inside the configuration of Overmind, where we set up all the namespaces, we have a namespace called Modals. And that Modals namespace, each model gets its own key. So you have like modals.commit model, modals.confirm something model, as you can see here. But to actually create these models, it uses a factory. And this is related to typing as well, because we want to type these results and the payload you pass to these functions, which is also a really tricky thing to get right. So the way this works is that we just have this factory, and then whenever we want to create a new model, we just insert it here, some model, and then you give it a default result. And in this first example, the default result is false, meaning that it already knows that it's a Boolean type. But for example, commit model, the default result is null. But then you can say that this is going to be a type of git commit, for example. But we can also have models which might have different types as a result, and then you can type it like this. So it's incredibly straightforward to define the state and the functionality to open and close it with the correct typing. This is all you have to do. And then, so then we have like the state and managing the opening and closing of them inside Overmind. And then you define the model inside the component. And you just define it as you would normally. So you create a component, it returns a model. To manage its open state, you point to state models confirm create file is open, for example. You can just set the size of it. On close, you point to actions models confirm create file, and then you close it. If you close without a payload, it uses the default payload, or sorry, the default result. If you give it a payload, it is typed. So it needs to be the type you put up here, and then that will be the result. The good thing about that is that now we can remove this models index file, because we have this big file now that has all the models and manages showing and mounting and unmounting them and stuff. That means that we can put the models where it makes sense. So some of the models are quite generic and should probably be high up the component tree, for example, preferences. But then we have other things like confirm create file model. That's only related to VS Code. So it should be like related to the VS Code component. Or for example, commit, like the git commit model should be inside the git component. Yes. But the benefits we gain with this approach is that on one end, we centrally define all the models. We have one file we can look at, and then we see all the models we have and what kind of result they can produce. But we still get the UI itself is defined with the rest of the UI where it is used, which makes sense to me. So we kind of like separate the the state and management of opening and closing it from how it looks and the size of it and stuff like that. The good thing is that we can split up where a model is opened and where it is closed. One thing is inside components, like one component can be responsible for opening it, and a completely different component can be responsible for closing it without having to pass props and stuff. But this also relates to actions. So if some action wants to open a model, a completely different action can close it. So for example, one button in the UI opens the model. Maybe you just trigger the action directly from a component. But then you have some other action which is triggered related to something you click inside the model. That should run lots of different logic. And when that's done, you want to close it. Or maybe there's like some event coming from the server or whatever. Something happens in Codesandbox that makes us want to close that freaking model. It means that models can be used anywhere. It can be used inside an action. So you can open a model from inside an action and you can wait for the result of it. We can pass actions that opens and closes models to effects. So for example, for VS Code, we would pass in the actions models confirm saved file. Open action, we pass that to VS Code so it can trigger it. And then we have some other piece of logic that closes that action. It closes that model. And then of course inside components, we are also able to open and close them. So again, we need the flexibility to open and close models in many different places. But we still want to like have everything typed and all this stuff. And I think this approach will never stop us from doing what we want to do. You could argue that it's too flexible. One thing being that, okay, so you try to open a model, but for some reason the model component hasn't been mounted yet, so nothing happens, for example. That could happen. So that's like one argument against it, but like the alternative is that we isolate too much, and that's the biggest problem. It's so much worse to isolate too much than having too much flexibility. So I know that this will solve any requirement down the road. And the really cool thing is that everything happens in the dev tools as well. So we know whenever something tries to open a model or tries to close a model, we see it in the dev tool. We even see the payload that is given when you close the model, which is super awesome. Okay, I hope this made sense, and please give me feedback if you have any concerns or you have any questions on how it works. I'm going to implement like a real proof of concept here, I suppose, because it's pretty much done, just so you can kind of like try it. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.